Picture this. You're sitting in a boardroom in Japan. You're 24 years old. No money, no company, no experience. The men across the table are serious, formal, measured. They've been listening to your pitch for 20 minutes. And then one of them leans forward and asks you the simplest question in the world. What is the name of your company? Your heart stops because you don't have one. You invented this meeting. You flew here on borrowed money. You've been bluffing your way through every sentence. What do? Most people panic, apologize, walk out. Phil Knight did something else entirely. He looked them straight in the eye, thought about the blue ribbons he used to win as a kid running track, and said, "Gentlemen, I represent Blue Ribbon Sports of Portland, Oregon." He made it up, on the spot, in real time. And that single improvised lie, that terrified bluff in a Japanese boardroom, became the seed of the most valuable sports brand in human history. This is Shoe Dog. And what happened after that lie? That's where things get truly insane. The crazy idea. Let's go back to where it all begins. 1962, Oregon. Phil Knight is 24 years old, freshly graduated from Stanford Business School, and he's feeling what a lot of us have felt, lost. He loved running, competed in college, but he wasn't elite. And somewhere in the gap between what he dreamed and what he was, he started feeling like his life had no direction. He tried the Army, felt nothing. He tried accounting, hated it. But at Stanford, something clicked. For a class assignment, he had to pitch a business idea. Most students wrote safe, forgettable papers. Phil wrote this: "Can Japanese sports shoes do to German sports shoes what Japanese cameras did to German cameras?" Think about what he'd noticed. Two German brands, Adidas and Puma, owned the American running market completely. Total dominance, nobody questioned it. But Phil had watched something happen in the camera industry. Nikon and Canon, Japanese brands, had quietly, systematically dismantled German dominance by making better products at lower prices. He thought, what if shoes are next? Now, nobody in that class cared. His friends shrugged, his professor gave him a passing grade and moved on. But Phil couldn't stop thinking about it. Here's something psychologically important about this moment. Phil didn't have a business plan, didn't have investors, didn't have a prototype. He had an idea. And the unusual ability to take it seriously when everyone around him didn't. That's rarer than we think. Most people have ideas. Almost nobody acts on them. The question was never, can this work? The question was, does this person have the nerve to find out? Phil decided to find out. The trip and the psychology of all in. After graduating, Phil Knight did something most 24-year-olds wouldn't dare. He convinced his parents to lend him some money, found a travel companion, and set off on a round-the-world trip. Not a vacation, a mission. Because somewhere in that journey, he planned to stop in Japan and actually try to make this idea real. Not think about it, not plan it, do it. They went to Hawaii first. Loved it so much they stayed longer than planned, getting jobs selling encyclopedias door-to-door just to fund the extension. Phil was terrible at it. He was shy, reserved, quiet in social situations. Cold selling to strangers was genuinely painful. But here's what's fascinating, and remember this moment because it matters later. The same person who couldn't sell encyclopedias to strangers would soon sell shoes so naturally it shocked even him. Why? Because he believed in the shoes. He had zero belief in encyclopedias. Conviction is the difference between a great salesman and a great founder. Phil didn't know it yet, but he was about to find out. His friend eventually fell for a Hawaiian girl and stayed. Phil continued alone, made his way to Japan, to the city of Kobe. And in Kobe, he walked into a store and picked up a shoe, a tiger, made by Onitsuka. He held it, turned it over, examined the sole, felt the weight. It was light, precise, elegant. Compared to the clunky American shoes of the early 1960s, it felt almost futuristic. He had to get inside this company. So, with nothing but nerve and a copy of a book called How to Do Business with the Japanese, he cold-called Onitsuka headquarters. They agreed to meet. And that same company he was about to walk into, it would later try to destroy everything he built. But we'll get to that. The Boardroom Bluff. Phil Knight puts on his only suit, walks into the Onitsuka building, sits across from a row of serious Japanese executives. No company, no office, no capital, no track record. Just a 24-year-old with a Stanford paper nobody cared about and facts he'd memorized the night before. But, and this is the key, he'd done his homework. He knew the American market size. He knew the gap between domestic shoes and what Onitsuka was making. He knew the numbers. So when the meeting started, he spoke with authority. He laid out the opportunity methodically. He sounded somehow like someone who absolutely knew what they were doing. The executives were impressed. And then the question came. What is the name of your company? Silence. Phil's mind raced. In that split second, two choices. Tell the truth or commit. Gentlemen, Blue Ribbon Sports of Portland, Oregon. He pulled the name from nowhere. A flash of his childhood blue ribbons at track events. The executives nodded. It sounded real, established, trustworthy. They agreed to send sample shoes, 12 pairs. Phil paid $50, borrowed from his father. He gave them his parents' home address as the Blue Ribbon Sports shipping address. He walked out having invented a company in real time, secured a partnership with a manufacturer he'd cold called 48 hours earlier, and set in motion something he couldn't fully comprehend yet. Now, here's the uncomfortable lesson buried in this scene. Phil didn't lie because he was dishonest. He lied because he believed in the vision so completely that he refused to let a technicality, you don't technically have a company yet, stand between him and the thing he knew was real. There's a version of this story where Phil tells the truth. The executives lose interest. And we never get Nike. Sometimes the gap between who you are and who you need to be to get the thing done requires a bridge. Phil built that bridge in real time, in a Japanese boardroom, with nothing but nerve. The wait, the most important lesson. Phil Knight flew home. 1 month, nothing. 2 months, nothing. 3 months, nothing. His father, who'd lent him the $50, told him flatly, "Son, that money's gone." Phil went back to work as an accountant, the job he hated, the life he was escaping. But here's what's psychologically critical about this stretch, and most summaries skip it entirely. This is the period where most people quit. The evidence pointed clearly to, you were scammed, the deal fell through, move on. Any rational person would have closed the door. Phil kept writing to Onitsuka, kept believing the shoes were coming. And then, nearly a year later, 12 pairs of Tiger running shoes arrived at his parents' doorstep. What this teaches is simple and brutal. The timeline is almost never the one in your head. Most people interpret delay as failure. Phil interpreted it as inconvenience. That reframe, this is slow, not dead, is one of the most underrated mental skills a person can have. Because everything worth building takes longer than expected. Always. The people who succeed aren't the ones who move fastest. They're the ones who don't mistake slow for stopped. The shoes were here. Now, what do you do with 12 pairs of running shoes and no store? The right partner changes everything. Phil Knight didn't go to a store, didn't immediately try to sell them. He went to see his old track coach, Bill Bowerman. Bowerman was a legend in Oregon running. He'd trained Olympic athletes. He was famous for one very specific obsession. He would take his athletes' shoes, cut them apart, and rebuild them. Lighter materials, better cushioning, modified soles. He wasn't just a coach. He was a walking laboratory for athletic footwear. Phil showed him the Tigers. Bowerman didn't just like them. He offered to become a partner. They each put in $500, ordered 300 pairs of Tiger shoes from Japan. Blue Ribbon Sports was officially real. Now, look at what Bowerman brought that Phil couldn't. Phil had vision, sales instinct, relentless drive. Bowerman had credibility, athlete connections, and product genius. Neither would have built what they built alone. This is one of the most consistent patterns in the history of great companies. The visionary and the builder, the dreamer and the maker. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, Knight and Bowerman. Here's the question that pattern forces on you. The idea isn't enough. The drive isn't enough. Who is your Bowerman? Who has the specific skill you don't and would believe in this crazy thing alongside you? Find that person. Everything changes. Selling from the trunk, 300 pairs of shoes. No store, no distributor, no marketing budget. Phil Knight threw them in the trunk of his green Plymouth Valiant and drove to track meets across Oregon and California. Remember that shy, introverted guy who couldn't sell encyclopedias? He disappeared. At every track meet, Phil would approach coaches, runners, fans, pull out a pair of Tigers, explain, with genuine passion, exactly why they were better. The weight, the sole construction, the grip. People bought them. Not because the pitch was slick, because they could feel his belief. This is one of the central psychological insights of the entire book. Conviction is contagious. When a founder believes in their product at a molecular level, that belief transmits. Customers don't experience it as a sales pitch. They experience it as a recommendation from someone who genuinely knows something they don't. Phil sold all 300 pairs in 3 months. First-year revenue, $8,000. Tiny. But the trajectory was undeniable. He immediately ordered 900 more pairs, then more, then more. Every dollar went straight back into inventory. No safety net, no savings account, just shoes going out, money coming in, money going immediately back into more shoes. This pattern, grow or die as Phil called it, became both the engine of Nike's rise and the source of its most terrifying near-death moments. Because growing at that speed requires one thing Phil never had enough of: cash. And when you run out of cash, even while growing, the walls close in very fast. Build a culture, not just a company. As demand grew, Phil Knight needed help. He hired his first full-time salesman, Jeff Johnson. Johnson was a runner, passionate, slightly obsessive, completely devoted to the shoes. Phil gave him almost no instructions. He said, "Sell shoes," and left the how entirely up to Johnson. What Johnson built was extraordinary. He didn't just sell, he connected. He wrote personal letters to every customer, remembered birthdays, asked about races, built a handwritten database of customer preferences, shoe sizes, and training goals. He designed the first blue ribbon retail store not as a shop, but as a sanctuary for runners. Bookshelves full of running literature, a place to hang out and talk, a community built around a shared obsession. Phil reflected later that none of this was possible because he'd given instructions. It was possible because he hadn't. This is what real leadership looks like from the inside, not management. Trust. Here's the deeper truth. Johnson cared so much because he wasn't executing a script. He was expressing himself. The best people don't want instructions. They want a mission, ownership, and the freedom to surprise you. Tell people what. Trust them with how. The betrayal and the birth of everything. By the late 1960s, Blue Ribbon Sports was thriving. Bill Bowerman had designed a shoe called the Cortez. It became the best-selling running shoe in America in 1969. Revenue was approaching $300,000 a year. Everything seemed secure. It wasn't. Phil Knight began noticing cracks. Onitsuka's shipments were repeatedly late. Design suggestions from Bowerman were being ignored. And when a new Onitsuka export manager named Kitami flew to visit the Blue Ribbon offices, something felt off. He was cold, distant, uninterested in renewing their partnership. Phil's instincts fired. One day, while Kitami stepped out of the meeting room, Phil did something impulsive. He opened Kitami's briefcase. Inside, a list of 18 American athletic shoe distributors. With scheduled meetings already booked, Onitsuka was quietly replacing them. After everything Blue Ribbon had done, after building Onitsuka's entire American presence from scratch, after Bowerman's designs had made their shoes famous across the country, they were being erased. Phil confronted them. Onitsuka's response was cold and corporate. Sell us 51% of Blue Ribbon, or we find other distributors. Phil refused immediately. But now he faced an existential problem. His entire company was built on selling someone else's shoes. He had no product of his own, no manufacturer, no independent brand, just a team that believed in him and a market he'd spent years building that Onitsuka was about to hand to someone else. Most people in this moment would have crumbled. Phil called a meeting with his full team. Everyone around the table looked defeated, slumped, like the end had already arrived. And Phil said something that changed the energy in the room completely. This isn't a crisis. This is our liberation. No more selling someone else's brand. No more waiting on delayed shipments from Japan. No more watching their innovations handed to a manufacturer that ignored them. They were going to make their own shoes. They needed a name. Phil's first idea? Dimension 6. Nobody liked it. Jeff Johnson, their first employee, said a name had come to him in a dream: Nike, the Greek goddess of victory. Phil wasn't immediately sold, but they were out of time. The factory needed a name. A decision had to be made right now. Nike it was. For the logo, they hired a graphic design student named Carolyn Davidson. She created the now iconic swoosh, a simple curved stripe evoking speed and motion. Her fee, $35. $35 for one of the most recognized symbols in human history. In 1971, Blue Ribbon Sports officially became Nike Inc. And here's what's psychologically remarkable about this entire sequence. Nike didn't become what it became despite Onitsuka's betrayal. It became what it became because of it. The constraint forced creation. The betrayal forced independence. The crisis forced them to become something they never would have become if the comfortable arrangement had simply continued. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is the thing that finally makes you. The $25 million ambush. By the mid-1970s, Nike was on fire. Revenue doubling every year. The brand crossing from athletic gear into street culture. The swoosh appearing on feet that had never run a race. Phil Knight was reinvesting every dollar back into growth, borrowing aggressively, ordering more inventory than cash could technically support, betting on the trajectory. Grow or die. Always. And then one morning, a letter arrived from the United States Customs Service Nike owed $25 million in back import duties. Phil thought it was a clerical error. Made some calls. It wasn't. Here's what happened, and it's one of the most ruthless business maneuvers you'll ever hear. Nike's American competitors, Converse Keds, a handful of domestic manufacturers, were watching Nike eat their market share, and they were terrified. So they went to Washington. They found an obscure pre-depression law called the American Selling Price Rule, ASP. It said, if an American company makes a shoe, any imported similar shoe must pay duties equal to 20% of the American competitor's retail price. Not the importer's price, the competitor's price. The trap was elegant and vicious. All Nike's competitors had to do was manufacture cheap copies of Nike's most popular shoes and price them astronomically high. This inflated the American price, which made Nike's import duties skyrocket. Then they applied it retroactively, 3 years back, $25 million. Overnight. If Nike paid it, they were bankrupt. Everything. Gone. This is the part of the Nike story nobody talks about. The almost assassination, not by a competitor outperforming them, but by competitors using the government as a weapon when they couldn't compete on product. Phil's response, fight. He hired the best lawyers he could find. He ran TV ads telling Nike's story, making customers into advocates. He made the battle public. 3 brutal years later, by which time Nike's sales had grown to $440 million, they settled for $9 million. Phil considered it robbery. But the lesson it writes in Fire is this: the bigger you get, the bigger the target on your back. Success doesn't protect you, it exposes you. And the people threatened by your success will use every tool available, including laws, politics, and government, to stop you if they can't compete with you on merit. Knowing this isn't cynicism, it's preparation. The Waffle, where obsession meets innovation. We need to pause the corporate drama for a moment, because some of Nike's greatest innovations came from the most absurdly simple places. Bill Bowerman was always tinkering. He'd dissect shoes, rebuild them, test new materials on athletes, sometimes improving their performance dramatically, sometimes making their feet bleed. One Sunday morning, Bowerman was sitting at his kitchen table, staring at his wife's waffle iron. He had a thought. What if the sole of a running shoe looked like this? He poured liquid rubber into the waffle iron. After destroying several of his wife's waffle irons in the process, the waffle sole was born. A revolutionary tread pattern. Lighter, grippier, more responsive than anything on the market. It became one of the defining design elements of early Nike. Here's what this moment captures about how real innovation happens. It's almost never a flash of genius in a research lab. It's usually an obsessive person staring at something completely ordinary and asking, what if? Bowerman wasn't a product designer. He was a track coach who loved shoes so much he couldn't stop thinking about them at breakfast. That's it. Passion is the engine of innovation. Not process, not budget, Not brainstorming sessions, just someone who cares enough to try something weird. The marketing genius. By the early 1980s, Nike was big, but Adidas still owned basketball culture. Nike was primarily known for running shoes. Breaking into basketball meant going up against a dominant brand on its home turf. They needed something. Someone. In 1984, they signed a rookie from North Carolina. His name was Michael Jordan. Here's a detail most people don't know. Jordan didn't want to sign with Nike. He preferred Adidas. His agent had to practically force him onto the plane to Oregon. Nike's pitch was unusual. They didn't just offer an endorsement fee. They offered Jordan something no brand had done at that scale before. His own signature line. Air Jordan, a shoe built around a person's identity, not a logo slapped on an athlete. When Air Jordans launched in 1985, the NBA banned them for violating their uniform color code. Nike paid Jordan's fines every time he wore them. And that ban became the greatest marketing story in sports history. Every time the NBA fined Jordan, it was a headline. Every headline was free advertising. Every piece of coverage made kids want those shoes more desperately. Air Jordans generated $100 million in their first year. What Nike truly understood, that competitors didn't, was this. Athletes aren't billboards. They're stories. The most powerful marketing doesn't sell a product. It sells a person's journey and lets the audience see themselves inside it. Jordan wasn't just wearing shoes. He was becoming something. And Nike was along for the ride. The psychology of Phil Knight. Let's zoom out for a moment, because Shoe Dog is not really a business book. It's a psychological autobiography of a very specific kind of person. And the most interesting subject isn't the company. It's Phil Knight himself. Phil describes himself, honestly repeatedly, as shy, introverted, reserved, more comfortable with numbers and silence than people and parties. He was not a natural leader in the conventional sense. No rousing speeches, no natural charisma, no glad handing. What he had was different. Absolute certainty in the mission and complete flexibility about the method. He would bluff his way into a Japanese boardroom. He would invent an East Coast office to close a deal. He would order more shoes than he could afford every single month. But he never sold bad shoes and claimed they were good. He never lied to his employees about the company's real situation. He never broke trust with the people who believed in him. Here's the paradox that runs through the entire book. Phil was reckless tactically and completely principled in character. He improvised the what. He never compromised the who. The bluffs were always about scale, pretending to be bigger than he was. Never about quality. Never about integrity. And that distinction is everything, because people followed Phil not because he had all the answers. They followed him because they trusted that his answers, however improvised, came from someone who genuinely cared about the right things. Going public and the human moment. In 1980, Nike went public. Phil Knight, the 24-year-old nobody from Oregon who had bluffed his way into a Japanese boardroom on borrowed money, woke up that morning worth $178 million. But the moment in this story that hits hardest has nothing to do with Phil's net worth. Early in Nike's history, when the company was nearly bankrupt and every bank had stopped lending, a woman offered to help. Her name was Nell Woodell, the mother of one of Phil's early employees, Bob. She and her husband handed over $8,000, their entire life savings, virtually everything they had. She didn't do it as an investment strategy. She did it because she believed in Phil and she wanted to see the company survive. She received shares in return. On the day Nike went public, Phil personally called to tell her. Her $8,000 was now worth $1.6 million. Phil Knight, who had faced $25 million government threats, near bankruptcy, international legal battles, and the complete collapse of his original partnership, said this was one of the happiest moments of his life. Not a revenue milestone, not an IPO figure, not beating Adidas, telling a woman who'd believed in him when no one else was watching that her faith had changed her family forever. Because here's what that moment reveals about building something real. At the end, it's not about the company. It's about the people who believed in you before you were believable. Those people are the real foundation. Everything else is built on top of them. The darkness behind the swoosh. This script would be dishonest if it didn't address something. Shoe Dog is Phil Knight's memoir. And like all memoirs, it tells the story the author chooses to tell. But Nike's history has a chapter Phil doesn't dwell on. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Nike faced devastating exposure over labor conditions in overseas factories. Investigations found workers in Vietnam, Indonesia, and Cambodia, factories producing Nike products, facing dangerous conditions, below minimum wages, and in some cases, child labor. The backlash was significant. Campus protests, consumer boycotts, a notable drop in stock price. Phil was forced to confront something uncomfortable. The very thing that made Nike possible, affordable overseas manufacturing, had come at a human cost he hadn't fully examined. Nike was among the first major brands to publicly list all factory locations, invite independent audits, and implement supplier conduct standards. They made documented improvements. Human rights organizations have acknowledged genuine progress. But allegations have never fully stopped. As recently as 2021, new complaints were filed. Why bring this up here? Because Shoe Dog itself teaches something important. Great builders are rarely purely heroic. Phil Knight made extraordinary decisions across 50 years. He also benefited from systems he didn't examine closely enough for too long. The most dangerous place in any company is wherever the founder stops asking questions. This doesn't erase what Nike built, but it means the full story requires honesty, not just the inspirational version. So what does any of this actually mean for you? Not motivation, not inspiration that fades in 48 hours. 3 things: specific, usable, starting today. Strategy 1, make the commitment before you feel ready. Here's how this works psychologically. The moment you declare something out loud, to a room, to a partner, to anyone, your brain stops asking, should I do this, and starts asking, how do I make this real? The declaration creates the pressure. The pressure creates the action. You're not lying. You're setting a target your actions have to grow into. So whatever you've been waiting to announce, the business, the project, the idea, say it out loud first. Build the reality second. Strategy 2, stop looking for what's missing. Start looking for who's missing. Most people try to learn every skill they lack. That's the slow path. The fast path is finding the one person who already has what you don't and shares the obsession. Here's the test. Does this person bring a skill the mission genuinely needs, not just enthusiasm for it? Vision without a builder stays a dream. A builder without vision builds the wrong thing. Before your next move, ask who's missing from this. Then go find that person. That one decision changes more than any strategy, tool, or plan you could make alone. Strategy 3. When everything falls apart, ask what it's forcing you to build. Every setback has a hidden question inside it. What would I never have created if this hadn't gone wrong? Most people treat obstacles as proof they're on the wrong path. The ones who build something real treat obstacles as instructions, a forced redirection towards something better than what they were originally chasing. Next time something collapses on you, don't ask, why is this happening? Ask, what is this making room for? That question alone will take you further than any plan that goes smoothly ever could. You just spent 20 minutes inside one of the most unique success stories ever told. And the honest truth is, the gap between that story and yours isn't talent. It's not money. It's not timing. It's not luck. It's the moment you stop waiting for conditions to be perfect and decide that this, right now, with exactly what you have, is enough to start. So before you close this tab, what's the one thing you've been waiting to be ready for? Say it in the comments. Because the craziest ideas said out loud for the first time have a way of becoming real. Hit like if this gave you something. Subscribe for more.